psychedelic medicine has actually been around for quite some time and used by many different cultures. Yet, there are existing biases and barriers that make it a challenge to study. Can we critically examine some of the history that might have shaped our own biases, and are we willing to do that? Also, how might we include marginalized populations in psychedelic research studies when most studies are conducted on Western populations? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Sun. Today we have Dr. Joseph Zamaria, a licensed board-certified clinical psychologist and associate professor of psychiatry at UC San Francisco. His clinical interests include psychodynamic therapy, internal family systems, and third-wave cognitive behavioral therapies such as ACT. Dr. Zamaria is a member of the Association of Black Psychologists and is also a founding member of the American, Arab, Middle Eastern, and North African Psychological Association. Dr. Zamaria is currently the Associate Program Director for Psychotherapy for the Psychiatry Residency Training Program at UCSF. In the area of research, Dr. Zamaria's efforts has been in psychedelic-assisted therapy, and he is the principal investigator of a study examining the harm reduction efficacy of a psychedelic peer support hotline. He serves as a clinician and researcher in clinical trials examining the potential of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy to treat a range of conditions, and has a faculty appointment at UC Berkeley, serving as a lead psychotherapy educator at the Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics. In addition to his clinical teaching and research activities, he is also on the editorial board of the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs and is on the advisory board of the Fireside Project. As a multiracial psychologist of Arab, African, and European descent, Dr. Zamaria will be discussing psychedelic-assisted therapy for minoritized populations. Dr. Zamaria, thank you so much for being on our show today, and welcome.
Thanks so much, Jack. I'm really glad to be here with you today.
Psychedelic-assisted therapy has been a hot topic. Tell me about this work.
Yeah, so I could contextualize it in the broader field of like the inception of psychedelic-assisted therapy. I could also talk about my own history, basically starting since I was a graduate student up until now. I'll briefly do both of those, and then maybe we can dig in a little deeper if there's an area of it that's interesting to you. So yeah, it was the mid-20th century that the American medical establishment, the Western medical establishment, became curious about psychedelic substances. And predating this by many years are cultures which have ancestral connections and relationships to psychedelic plants and fungus, psychedelic medicine. So it was only until the 20th century, fairly recent history, that the psychiatric, the medical establishment became curious about psychedelics, and at first didn't really know where to place them. At first they called them psychotomimetics. These were drugs that they believed mimicked psychosis, where they
interesting.
You could ingest this substance, and for a finite period of time, people could experience psychosis. And then when the drug wore off, the psychosis wore off. And that's actually quite a misnomer. There's big differences between, there are a few interactions, but there's a big difference between psychotic experience and the experiences that most people report with psychedelic drugs. So we'll think about, let's say, the 40s or the 50s was when the medical establishment first became curious about psychedelics. Shortly after, probably late 50s into the 60s, they were using psychedelics in treatment. There were thousands of papers. There were a bunch of conferences. The papers involved clinical trials where they treated tens of thousands of patients for conditions like alcoholism and depression with, at the time, usually LSD, sometimes psilocybin, they're closely related compounds. In a moment, I'll define a psychedelic just so we know what we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. And they found a lot of success using psychedelics as an adjunct to psychotherapy. There were methodological and perhaps ethical issues with how some of this research in the mid-20th century was conducted, but it still boded something promising. There was something interesting here. There was some traction here. In 1970, Richard Nixon made all psychedelic drugs illegal and placed them on Schedule 1, which is the most restrictive scheduling of substances in our country, which effectively halted research. So 1970, or shortly after 1970, was kind of the end of that chapter. Okay, so in a moment, I'll flash forward to the more contemporary field, and as well as my involvement in it.
Well, I also appreciate that history because, it's anchored on the fact that indigenous populations and historical uses of psychedelics, it's been present, but then it wasn't until you said the mid, was it 1950s or so, that Western medicine and therapy started to incorporate that. In many ways, by also classifying it as a Schedule 1, it creates a sense of stigma that I know, is we start to internalize, oh, psychedelics, there's a stigma against this type of treatment.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And if you want to take it even a step farther, we can think of how Western culture was both stigmatizing practices that have maybe been in a culture's ancestral lineage for hundreds or maybe thousands of years. So in some ways, they were villainizing those practices by expressing skepticism or requiring that they're administered in these particular secular clinical settings and stuff. But also they were appropriating aspects of those cultures. Many, by the way, there are cultures on every continent in the world which have relationships with psychedelic medicine, some, for hundreds or thousands of years. And one example of that appropriation is with the concept of set and setting. So with psychedelics, this is a term we use to describe the context that the psychedelic is being administered in. Set refers to the user's mindset. Setting refers to the setting. So mindset could include things like your mood, your beliefs about psychedelics, your beliefs about mental health treatment, your beliefs about ingestion of psychedelics, your beliefs about the legal system, all kinds of stuff. It could include any stressors you're going through in that moment, in that moment of time in your life. So these are all factors that inform set. Setting includes, the physical location. Is it a home, a hospital, a clinic, nature, a concert? It's also the interpersonal setting. Who are you with? Doctors, nurses, psychologists, therapists, friends, family, strangers, nobody. So that is a concept that also has deep ancestral connection to how psychedelics were held in a lot of cultures that had rituals, that performed ritual use of psychedelic administration. So cultures have known this for a long time, that the context is supremely important. But it wasn't till, a researcher named Timothy Leary, who was a really controversial figure, a professor at Harvard who was researching psychedelics in the 60s, coined those terms, set and setting, to describe clinically how we can optimize the administration of psychedelics. So you can see it's taking the concept from these ancestral communities, but putting sort of a modern Western psychological label on it. And it's helped people. It's helped psychologists and therapists and medical and clinical environments to express this principle. But at the same time, it's kind of taken without asking from cultures that have had relationships.
It's like by naming this concept, somehow there's a sense that a lot of the work is accredited to this individual as opposed to an ancestral practice.
That's right. So anytime anybody cites set and setting, I mean, it's now you can find it in literally every, I don't know about literally, but virtually every psychedelic publication that you pick up. Set and setting is likely going to be mentioned. So it's so commonplace. It's like talking about rapport in psychotherapy or something. It's just so common. But Leary would be getting all this credit, and so it's an interesting. Leary was very smart and helpful to the field in some ways. It's no shade thrown to him in particular, but it's more like it highlights how colonialism and how appropriation kind of operates. That then there's this person receiving all this credit who's very centered, and they may or may not pay credence to those cultures and communities from which they derive those terms and ideas.
Yeah, that's such an important discussion. Now, can you go back and define the what you mean by psychedelic?
Yeah, for sure. And then I think after that, we'll try to bridge to the modern, what's happening now and what I'm doing now and stuff. But yeah, so psychedelics, it's a flexible definition, and it's hard to find one singular consistent definition. Some definitions are very liberal, and they include lots of substances, regardless of pharmacologic action, as long as they are producing this particular state of consciousness. Some definitions are far more conservative, and they refer to a particular set of chemical compounds, which would be like a subset of that bigger group, which produce a characteristic range of effects. So the conservative definition includes LSD and similar compounds. We call these the classic psychedelics. They're all serotonergic, so they're agonists to our serotonin receptors. They plug in really nicely somehow to our serotonin receptors, and it includes, many drugs, but the hallmark ones are LSD, which was first synthesized in Europe in the 1930s. It was first consumed by Albert Hofmann, who was the chemist who synthesized it in the 30s. He accidentally ingested it in the 40s, and he had this wild experience. And he rode his bike home from the lab, and he was very, it sounds very harrowing and very, he was anxious, he was nervous, but it was also remarkable. He didn't know what was happening. He didn't expect this to happen. And so some people commemorate this day, April 19th, 1943, as Bicycle Day. It's a day you celebrate sort of the first time a human intentionally ingested LSD. So classic psychedelics include LSD. They include psilocybin, which exists in over, I think, about 200 species of mushrooms worldwide. So when people say they're taking magic mushrooms or psychedelic mushrooms, very likely it is psilocybin-containing mushrooms. Psilocybin and LSD have different but quite similar effects. There's a lot of crossover. It also includes mescaline, which is found in certain types of cactus. So there's a type of North American cactus called peyote, which different groups, including the Native American church based in New Mexico, I believe, and then the Huichol, which is a Mesoamerican group of indigenous people, have a relationship with this particular cactus, where its ritual use and consumption is a deep part of these cultures. In South America, there's another cactus called San Pedro, which also contains mescaline. Notably, peyote is it's endangered, and it's susceptible to poaching. It takes a long time for these cactuses to fruit into something productive. And indigenous communities in the United States have legal right to use these substances, even though mescaline is a Schedule I substance. But poachers, perhaps black market drug dealers, or kids looking to find some peyote or whatever, are reducing access of peyote to these particular groups. San Pedro, the South American cactus that also contains mescaline, is much more readily available. In fact, you could buy it in the United States at a plant store. Most plant stores can sell it. It is against federal law to ingest that plant, but you can purchase it from the stores. Just don't eat it if you want to be in line with federal law. And finally, the last of the classic psychedelics is DMT, or dimethyltryptamine. This exists in many plants and actually animals across the world. Most notably, it's used in a brew that is consumed by indigenous groups in the Amazon called ayahuasca. So ayahuasca has two primary ingredients. One contains DMT, which is actually not orally available to us. If you consume something with DMT, it will not have a psychoactive effect because of monoamine oxidase in your stomach. But the cultures and people who produce ayahuasca combined plants that contain DMT with plants that contain MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So then it turns into this essentially tea, this brew that people can drink, and it becomes orally active. Although people can smoke, snort, vape, etc., other DMT, and it's a different experience than the consumption of ayahuasca. That's the classic psychedelics. That's the conservative definition. The broader definition would include substances like MDMA. They used to call it ecstasy. Now on the street they call it Molly. Methylene dioxymethamphetamine, which is actually kind of it's like a quasi-psychedelic stimulant. It has a stimulant effect. It has the word methamphetamine in the chemical name. It's not nearly as powerful a stimulant or as addictive or harmful a stimulant as methamphetamine, but it is indeed a stimulant. And it produces some kind of quasi-psychedelic effects. Also ketamine. which is a dissociative drug. It's a surgical anesthetic, can also produce sort of quasi-psychedelic states, which seem to be psychotherapeutically helpful. So that's not an exhaustive list, but that could give you an idea of what's the conservative definition of psychedelics, what's the more liberal definition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I'm more familiar with the broader definition.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, and so that's how it's often used clinically. Like some people will say, I'm training to be a psychedelic-assisted therapist. I'm training to give ketamine, or I'm training to give MDMA. And it's, they're kind of getting lumped together. If you want to be more precise about it or a stickler about it, you'd say, well, MDMA is not exactly a psychedelic, but
yeah. I was curious about MDMA just because that I think it was hot back in the early 2000s.
Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. I think the MDMA, if I'm correct, it was first synthesized over 100 years ago by a pharmaceutical company, well before it had any history or use as a recreational party drug. It was used as a psychotherapy drug. This was in the kind of the last half of the 20th century, 60s, 70s, 80s. And it was used with great success, and it wasn't regulated. At this time, MDMA was not illegal or scheduled, I believe, at the federal level until 1980 or the early 80s. So during this stretch of time, 60s to the 80s, lots of therapists were using MDMA. It seemed to be uniquely helpful in couples therapy and also in trauma therapy for some notable reasons. You think about what happens when you give a group of people MDMA. If they're at a party or they'll become more relational. They become more connected, more empathic, less fearful, less aggressive towards each other. So imagine the effect this might have on a couples therapy. Really rich, deep sessions. People are less defended. They're more just totally vulnerable and intimate with each other and can hear each other more clearly. With trauma therapy also, we're seeing now the results are starting to have been and are continuing to accrue for some time, that it seems MDMA seems to be a really effective adjunct to trauma psychotherapy. What makes it hard to engage in trauma therapy? If somebody's been through a singular or complex trauma, trusting a provider could be really hard. Or desiring to confront and approach all these traumatic, singular or multiple traumatic events. Most people have an aversion to doing that. So it takes a long time, a lot of safety. It's baby steps. MDMA seems to increase trust, lower fear, kind of increase openness and curiosity and compassion. It doesn't numb people out. I've seen people be intensely emotional in MDMA-assisted therapy sessions. It just seems to be, it's kind of like swimming with a kickboard instead of swimming on your own or something. It gives you something to kind of glide on and something to kind of rest on, so the work can move a little bit more quickly.
Yeah. Wow. As you're describing a lot of these benefits and just a lot of different options, as well as the historical lineage to some of these cultures, how did you get into this work?
Yeah. So I was actually interested in psychedelics before I was even on path to becoming a clinical psychologist. I'm okay disclosing some of this information. Suffice it to say, I was a psychology undergrad, studying psychology, was very interested in psychology. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it. I was a double major. I was a philosophy major, and I thought I was going to go to law school. I took the LSAT. I thought that was what was in the cards for me. I wasn't a big drug user in college because I was an athlete, and we were, well, on the one hand we were getting drug tested, and on the other hand, we're mostly trying to optimize our health and performance and this sort of stuff. And so I didn't really use a lot of drugs in college. But around this time, I had a few experiences with psychedelics that were they were unbelievably powerful. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and things made so much sense to me, and I felt like I was getting as much education from the handful of times I used psychedelics at that time as I did in any classroom or any athletic or social experience I had in college. So I was deeply interested in psychedelics, but I was still about maybe 2-3 years out from applying to grad school. It took some time for me to realize I wasn't going to go to law school. I was going to apply. I interviewed psychologists and thought about what it would look like to go to grad school, put applications together, and so on. And by the time I applied, I got accepted. I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area and I started school. For the first even maybe year or more of the time I was in school, it took me 6 years to get my doctorate. I didn't think that there was going to be any feasible connection between what I was understanding to be true about my psychedelic experiences and what I've heard many people report now that I was kind of digging into some of the literature and my clinical training, until some publications started coming out from major research institutions in the United States that were legitimizing and kind of reinstating. Remember the 1970 cutoff? Once can't remember the name of the act in the moment, but Richard Nixon's act, which made all psychedelics illegal. It was the first decade of the 21st century, really. A little bit of research in the 90s with a guy named Rick Strassman at University of New Mexico, who was administering DMT to patients. That was probably the first sort of thing that set off the current psychedelic renaissance. But in the very early first decade of the 21st century, papers were coming out from Johns Hopkins University or New York University, other institutions nationally and globally, demonstrating that psychedelics could be administered safely, feasibly, sometimes even therapeutically to people. And so once I started seeing that this research was coming out, I decided to become more involved. I made my research in graduate school about psychedelics. I published long interviews with people who reported benefit from using psychedelics, qualitative interviews, interviewed a handful of people, reported on their results, looked at thematically what was happening for those people and published it. And then, shortly after graduate school, I was getting licensed, and I was a postdoc fellow at UCSF, where I currently work, and I started to connect with some people. Before I even started as a licensed, kind of staff and then faculty at UCSF, I was already connected with somebody he was in training. He's a psychiatrist named Brian Anderson. He was a second-year resident. He was launching a clinical trial with psychedelics, and I was a therapist in that study. This was an open label pilot study, so small number of patients. There's no double-blind placebo, any of that stuff. Everybody knew they were receiving psilocybin. The population were older gay men in the San Francisco Bay Area who were long-term HIV or AIDS survivors. And the model of the treatment was very interesting too. The guys got a lot of group therapy first, sans, no psychedelics, sans psychedelics. Each person then had their own psychedelic experience over the course of 2 weeks, and then the group reconvened to have more group therapy.
Well, I'm actually shocked by this study because you recruited a minoritized population to participate in psychedelic assisted therapy, and we know that it's very difficult to recruit minoritized populations in these type of treatments. So that is amazing that y'all did that. I'm actually curious, how did that unfold? Well, I mean, how were you able to do that?
Yeah, I can't take credit for much. I participated as a therapist and contributed in a few other ways to the study. It's really Brian Anderson and a couple of the people he was working closely with who kind of designed the treatment. Knowing Brian, I'm sure he wanted to center people who have been historically marginalized or minoritized. As we may discuss a little later, many people of color are understandably unsure or skeptical about psychedelic use generally, are unsure about psychedelics being administered in hospital and clinical environments, are unsure about participating in medical research for many reasons, including many sins that have been committed against minoritized people by those institutions, academic and medical institutions. However, the group that we had for this study, it was older HIV survivors. They were gay men. It was not a terribly diverse group by some metrics. So there were a few people of color involved. I can't remember the percentages right now, but I want to say maybe 80% roughly were white people, white older gay male AIDS survivors. So minoritized people for sure, and people who've been through really the AIDS epidemic, particularly here in the Bay Area, was a harrowing experience, and they lost a lot of friends and thought they lost their lease on life because of their diagnosis. So I think different minoritized groups of people may have different transferences or different relationships to psychedelics. People of color may be more skeptical than Caucasian gay men for a whole bunch of cultural reasons.
Yeah. Okay. And so it's almost as though thinking about early in your career, by seeing some of these studies getting published by reputable institutions also gave you permission that, hey, this is something I can do. And I know the benefits and I can research this.
Exactly. It wasn't conclusive. And there are harms that where psychedelics are responsible. They're not harmless substances. They're substances which must be treated with great respect. They're not for everybody. There are many people who could be helped by conventional psychological or psychiatric means that don't necessarily need to take any kind of psychedelic. So there's some caveats there. But yeah, it was an opening. It was an end to say it's legitimate enough that it's worthwhile to get looked at. Because faculty at my school were pretty skeptical. Many didn't want to work with me. Many were understandably apprehensive and asked me a lot of questions about why they thought they thought I was a little crazy. They're like, why are you looking at giving people drugs? Why are you looking at getting people high? Why are you looking at potentially creating more risk and more harm for folks instead of doing what a good psychologist should do, which is be good at the things you are good at. Let's leave party drugs out of the equation. So there was apprehension and skepticism for sure.
So with the apprehension and skepticism as it pertains to the area of study that you're looking at, psychedelic medicine, how about this piece, which is in your career as a person of color, what were challenges you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
Yeah. Specific to psychedelic research or in general or what?
In general.
Yeah. Well, that's a big question. Well, it took me, I will say, partly because of my mixed race heritage and partly because of my Arab heritage. I'll explain that latter piece in a second. It was very hard for me, and partly because of where I'm from and who I grew up around and stuff. I didn't understand how to contextualize myself. I didn't understand how to understand myself. I also would like to note there's a lot of ways where I hold privilege and I can move through the world as quite a privileged person. It's not by virtue of my ethnicity or skin color, but by my maleness or my able-bodiedness or some other way. So I have to acknowledge that. So I think the confusion about my racial identity played a role where, like, I grew up in the Detroit area of Michigan. So on the one hand, it's the Midwest, and where I grew up, it was mostly white people everywhere. All the schools I went to, all the activities I did, all my friends essentially were white. Some say that there's a big Black population, there's a big Arab population in the Detroit area. I was not terribly connected to those populations because we lived because of the place that I lived in, we were not near those communities. My father was an immigrant, so a lot of our family friends were Arabs, but I didn't go to a school where there were a lot of Arabs. I didn't play on a sports team where there were a lot of Arabs, and same with people of African descent. So it wasn't until graduate school, the piece I wanted to add about being Arab is there is a way where people of Middle Eastern, North African, Arab identities are made to be invisible, are marginalized. I was thinking about this actually preceding meeting with you today, Jack, about how 100 years ago and more, a wave of European immigrants were landing on the East Coast of the United States. And these were people from Ireland and Poland and Italy, and these were Jewish immigrants. And at the time, they were not considered to be white people. The white people were the people who had migrated 100 years even before, who came from maybe Anglo-Saxon or Western European countries. And it's kind of wild to think about how is someone who's Irish not white, but we could see how whiteness as a construct is this class that's protected. And these were people who were fresh from their countries of origin that hadn't yet assimilated or adapted enough to whatever the emerging North American culture was at the time. So they had to, Jewish people, Italian people, Polish people had to attain whiteness. They had to assimilate enough and demonstrate whatever sort of value to society to be considered white people. For Arabs, it's almost the opposite. We're squashed into the group of white people. If you look at a census form, up until recently, there's been a little bit of motion here, which I'd be happy to talk about a little if there's time. But you look at, like, it will say, list your race or ethnicity, and it will say like Asian, and it might list, a bunch of countries in Asia, a bunch of cultures in Asia. It will say Black, and it might say African American, Caribbean, etc. And then it will say white, and it will say European, Middle Eastern, North African, and but I've never been sort of treated like a white person. I've never felt like I've had the privilege of a white person in the country. So there's a way where Arab identity gets invisibled too. Now, of course, there's a lot of Arabs can present all sorts of ways. There are white passing Arabs. Even if you look at my skin color, there are Arabs that are much darker than me. There's certainly African Americans and Black people who are much darker than me, and they have a bigger burden in terms of how they're regarded as in society and how they have to move through the world. But nevertheless, yeah, I think situating myself was part of the problem. Once I got to graduate school, I realized that there were professional bumps and hurdles along the way.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
there's so much here to unpack. There's one story from graduate school that comes to mind.
Yeah. But yeah, why don't we go to the challenge that you experienced in grad school?
Yeah, and it's related again to my Arab identity. So my first year of graduate school, I took a class. It was a full year class. I think they called it Intercultural Awareness Development. Okay, so it was, and particularly I went to a very progressive school. I moved to a very progressive part of the country, and it was kind of a crash course in intersectionality and oppression and privilege. And I think it was intentionally designed to be uncomfortable for people who hold more privilege than for others. So I remember a lot of my white colleagues, many of whom are very compassionate, smart, well-meaning people, but had a hard time understanding the purpose of the course. I think a lot of people of color felt quite validated by the goings on of the course, but I appreciated its intention. In the second semester of the course, I don't know if I would design a curriculum this way, but we did sort of a flavor of the week of like discussing different ethnicities. So that we'd had a week on Hispanic and Latinx Americans. We had a week on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and so on and so forth. And there was a separate class for Arabs and Middle Easterners. What I remember about the way that class was taught was it was very different than the way that any of the other classes were taught, which was meant to be from an empathic, sympathetic stance without any judgment towards those cultures, and more just considering the experience of people, whether they're immigrants or whether they have a distant lineage to these places, have a relationship with these cultures and experience themselves in psychotherapy or in psychological treatment in a certain sort of way. And we might be attuned to how people of different cultures might be inclined to see psychotherapy or see themselves in psychotherapy. When we covered Arab stuff, one of the professors really made it a point to talk about how regressive most of these countries are, how regressive
Oh
Islam
my
is.
gosh. Oh my gosh. What year was this?
This was 2008, 2009.
Oh my gosh. That's
It,
actually
it,
it's recent. I mean, oh gosh.
yeah, this is in San Francisco, California. Barack Obama had just got elected. It felt like a progressive time. The position of the professor was meant to champion other rights, like, well, in countries where there is, autocratic Islam, women or gay people don't have the same rights. They get stoned to death. This is what these people do. This is what that was a refrain he
Oh
kept coming
gosh.
back to.
Oh gosh. Perpetuating these stereotypes. Oh
Yeah,
god. Rather than
yeah.
looking at the cultural norms and systems that work for that group and kind of adopting a Eurocentric perspective essentially.
Correct, exactly. And like, if you really want to know so there in many cultures, not just in Arab or Muslim cultures, but in many cultures, there are clashes between the perspective of the culture and other aspects of human rights. But to get to the bottom of it, I would rather ask like an Iranian feminist what they think about being feminist or being a woman in Iran than imposing that from without and saying, well, your culture is regressive, and I hope you can see that it's anti-feminist or something. I'd rather ask an Iranian
Right.
feminist what they think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, because they're the one who is living the cultural identity while also advocating for feminism. And so how do they I guess navigate going, in that space? Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, gosh. Okay. Well, in thinking about, for our podcast, for you, what does it mean to be a multiracial psychologist of Amina descent?
Yes, more lately, I've thought of it as a responsibility because it's the case with any professional, I guess. If one was a lawyer or a physician or a teacher, or it's a power position, and you're a gatekeeper of information, and you're a purveyor of cultural norms and so on. And so I think being a multicultural psychologist has invited me to take up more responsibility, to look out for people who may not be in positions of power or who may be further minoritized than me. And so it's been an honor to kind of take on that charge, I guess. But yeah, everything I'm doing, I'm kind of looking at through that lens. I'm sure I have blind spots too, but going through my own experience and taking my own bumps in a way allows me, not just at the level of like conveying clinical care to patients, but teaching, training, working with multidisciplinary teams, doing research, seeing dynamics that resemble things I went through, that I was fortunate, actually, looking back, to have a taste of it, to be able to say, oh, that hurts, that's not good. I feel empowered to speak up now and to disrupt what I feel like are narratives that are counter to social justice.
Yeah, you're helping to speak up for others in a time back then when no one spoke up for you. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Joe, any other final thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one last piece. I know this was maybe what we were hoping to get to, but we went in a lot of directions today, and that's great. Psychedelics can be helpful for people who are minoritized. They can be helpful for people of color. People of color are going to be skeptical about involving themselves in clinical or medical research. So the results we see about psychedelic-assisted therapy may be skewed to European or kind of Eurocentric perspectives. It's incumbent upon practitioners to determine what are the appropriate cultural conditions that will satisfy people of many different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. There has been promise in using psychedelics to treat racial trauma. So racial trauma is trauma because of racism, essentially. Could be complex or acute, could be like, a hate crime or 50 years of microaggressions, all producing that same kind of like, either it's a swift blow or out of abrasion, producing that severing, producing that dissociation and trauma response. Psychedelics may be helpful to mitigate the effects of racial trauma. A researcher named Terrence Ching over at Yale has found that surveyed Asian Americans and found Asian people in North America, Canada and the United States, those two countries, found that it solidified ethnic identity development in this group of people, that it helped reduce experiences of racial trauma after an instance of racism. I'm launching a similar project looking at MENA population in the United States, just assessing attitudes, just looking at how Arabs, Middle Easterners, North Africans feel about psychedelics generally, feel about psychedelic-assisted therapy generally, just as the first step in trying to then find that culturally appropriate care that could eventually exist for this group of people, for Arabs, Middle Easterners, etc.
Now, you're essentially assessing attitudes and how receptive this population is to taking psychedelic medicine. May I ask why that is you're studying this particular topic for this population?
Part of it is to establish culturally attuned norms about how to deliver psychedelic-assisted therapy. But more importantly, this relates to, the awful war and genocide that we're seeing going on in Gaza, where there's going to be so many traumatized people. Psychedelic-assisted therapy has famously been used in the treatment of trauma in the face of even atrocities. There were Holocaust survivors that were patients of psychedelic-assisted therapy. There's a famous book called Shiviti, written by the survivor. It's a short book, I think it's a 100-page book. A Dutch psychiatrist administered LSD and helped him work through unspeakable trauma related to the Holocaust. I think we're going to see, because of what's going on in Gaza, decades and cycles, generations of waves of awful trauma where people will need culturally attuned care. If there are people who find their way in the United States and they're receptive to Western models of treatment, I would hope that we can deliver psychedelic-assisted therapy as we could to any other highly traumatized population that it has shown success in. So I thank you for the chance to speak to that.
Yeah. Also, thank you for thinking about just the gravity of the situation, how this treatment can really benefit this population. Also speaks to representation, because, yes, we can be culturally responsive. We also need to create pathways for MENA folks to be involved in delivering the care, so that, again, building that bridge of trust, so that, hey, we do need to adapt Western psychotherapy treatment in a way that can be beneficial for populations. Yeah.
Precisely. That's right. That's right.
Anything else? Any other final thoughts?
No, I'm just appreciative for your show. I appreciate how it highlights experience that has been marginalized for so long. I'm really, really glad to have been here today, and I'm also really appreciative that you reached out to Arab and Middle Eastern people in recent months, particularly in April, which was I think nationally, which was Arab Heritage Month, and so appreciative for your work there, Jack.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm so honored to have you speak on this topic and addressing the minoritized population and some of the discrimination and hurt that we experience in these academic and medical institutions, and to find ways to start to disrupt some of this through medicine, through you just showing up. Really, it's this amazing work that you are doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jack. I appreciate that a lot.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please share and subscribe to People of Color in Psychology. You can also support us by registering for continuing education courses or making a one-time donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. Their feedback is important to us, so feel free to send an email, a message on LinkedIn, or leave a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sun.